I am Dr. Seth Meyer. I will be the moderator. And I am very excited to be part of this. We have three not just really interesting panels about LGBTQ issues, but presenting LGBTQ issues in really diverse areas, from art to education to nonprofits. So I think this will really lead to a fascinating discussion on public administration and social equity around LGBTQIA issues. We will do each of the three presentations, and then at the end of each presentation, I think they're all about 10 minutes each, we will have a Q&A. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to, that you're just thinking of course, or you don't want to ask, you can always just put them in the chat. And when we do questions, just feel free to do the raise your hand or put the question in the chat. So the first person who's going to go is Ignacio. Please take it away.
Hi. Do you need to go through the presentation already, or should I just introduce myself?
You can pull up the presentation. You should be able to screen share.
Yeah, so let me do that. So hopefully you see that on screen.
Looks good.
Good. So you see the title card, I assume.
Yeah.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Ignacio Darnot, and I'm really grateful to the University of San Francisco for giving me the opportunity to participate in the Social Equity Leadership Conference. And to give you a little bit of a sense of my background, I've been in the film business for over 2 decades, and I left my positions as head of international marketing for Disney and then for Sony to develop a documentary series called Hiding in Plain Sight, Breaking the Queer Code in Art. And in the process, and based on 10 years of research on the subject, I'm now giving lectures in universities, LGBTQ centers, and via Zoom around the world on how, in spite of enormous repression, queer artists have revolutionized mainstream culture throughout history. And today, my lecture called Don't Say Gay, the Erasure of Queerness in Art, is about how, in spite of the huge impact of a queer artist, museums and the art world have historically erased their queerness, shattering any sense of cultural equity. So I want to start with a quick caveat. I'm going to be using the term queer instead of gay throughout the presentation. And the word queer, which was used as an insult against the LGBTQ community, while it's still not widely used in, for instance, in communities of color, lately it has been reappropriated by a broad section of the LGBTQ community as a proud defiance of heteronormativity. And I think this quote from the artist Larry Clark really summarizes it beautifully. He says, "Gay implies weak, fey. Queer is transgressive, audacious, and apologetic. Queer doesn't have a look, a gender. It defies boundaries. It absorbs and appreciates gay, and it doesn't care who you sleep with." But before I talk about social equity, I want to mention how, as the queer artist Nathan Blake indicates, the queer community is the only minority for what we do, not for who we are. Queer is the only culture and identity that is not transmitted through family. In fact, it contradicts family identity. That's why the history of queer art is very fragile. It's not meant to be written. But what is fascinating is that in spite of this, enormous challenge, a fact that is never taught in schools is that far from irrelevant, invisible, or just a new trend, queer art has appeared in every culture and in all media, crossing through all genders, races, and beliefs, from, as you can see here, from Egyptian tombs to Greek vases Renaissance sculptures, and modern-day photography. Not only that, many of the world's most valuable paintings have been created by queer artists, including the recent example of Marilyn Monroe's painting by Andy Warhol that sold for $195 million. However, when you ask people, the vast majority of the population cannot name any queer artists. Why is this? So I'm going to explain the reasons for this lack of awareness. So the history of queer art is intimately linked to the shifting perception of homosexuality through the ages. In ancient Greece, as you can see here, the relationship between an older man with a young man was an integral part of the young man's education to instill courage and honor in them. But it all changed with the advent of Christianity in the 4th century. When male homosexual acts were punished with death penalty, female homosexuality was not even considered. It was unfathomable. So these laws obviously had a seismic impact on art, with, for instance, erotic art disappearing completely. So from that moment on, queer artists face a dilemma: hide their sexuality or be out with their art and their lives, and in doing so, face prosecution from severe laws that were not repealed in many countries until recent times. I mean, you may not know this, but this is still an issue. Homosexuality was not decriminalized in the UK until 1967, and 71 countries still criminalize homosexuality today. But in my research, I uncovered how, in spite of this repression, queer artists have revolutionized art, survived scandals, won landmark battles, and transformed mainstream culture from the Renaissance, like you see here, Michelangelo, to modern times with the iconic American Gothic created by the queer artist Grant Wood. I love this quote from the author Camille Paglia. She says, "For 2,500 years, Western culture has fed itself on the achievements of a small bands of queer artists attaining visionary heights through defiance of the established code of beauty." And one example that is rarely discussed is that the pop movement, for instance, was created mostly by queer artists, such as Hockney, Warhol, Keith Haring, Jasper Jones, artists who rejected societal norms such as hypermasculinity and heteronormativity. But for centuries, museums have held double standards in regards to how they discuss artist sexuality. When artists are heterosexual like Picasso, we know everything about his female muses. However, up until very recently, when you bring up the sexuality of queer artists, the response from the conservative museum boards that are afraid of losing prestige or funding is usually, "Oh, that is irrelevant." And this don't ask, don't tell policy forces many curators to hide same-sex relationships from artists and closet admire queer figures, while conveniently they out disliked queer figures such as Caligula. So one of the many examples is the 7-year relationship between Jasper Jones and Robert Rauschenberg, which was crucial for the development as artists, but it hasn't been discussed openly until last year's Jasper Jones retrospective, 2021. And 3 years earlier, the Rauschenberg retrospective at MoMA described their life-changing relationship as an intense friendship. And instead, they focused on Rauschenberg's child from a brief relationship with a woman. The art critic of the Washington Post, Philip Kennicott, says it very well. The art world needs to confront a long record of hiding the outstanding contribution of queer artists, keeping them in the closet. And the queer artist David Wojnarowicz said, "Major museums make invisible any sexual images besides straight, white, male fantasies." As I'm going to show you in the next few slides, museums have purposely erased, stigmatized, censored, and pigeonholed the work of queer artists, provoking a nearly universal lack of awareness of queer artists and a glaring lack of social and cultural equity. For instance, in many cases, museums erase queer work from their exhibitions. The first Andy Warhol retrospective at MoMA in 1989 excluded his groundbreaking queer work, here's an example, as if it had been done by a different artist. The art world also stigmatizes queer artists. The 1999 Whitney exhibition, The American Century, avoided all references to queer artists except for AIDS, turning all queer artists invisible or into victims. And museums censor queer artists. The Robert Mapplethorpe 1989 exhibition was confiscated at the Corcoran Gallery in Washington when Jesse Helms succeeded in equating the terms art equal queer equal AIDS. And the art establishment barely resisted these anti-queer dictates. After this exhibition, there were no mainstream museum exhibitions about queer art in the United States for over 2 decades. So this erasure has a costly aftermath for queer artists. Up until very recently, many artists rejected the queer label because it could displace any other factor of their work, affect their reputation, critics' reaction, and even the price of their work. For instance, when Warhol's queer drawings got rejected, concerned that they would stop him from becoming a famous artist, Warhol transformed his art into pop and his image, becoming more androgynous than queer. And during the AIDS era, collectors stayed away from queer artists such as Robert Mapplethorpe because they thought these artists wouldn't live long enough to make a significant cultural impact, and consequently, they wouldn't return their market value. So now, concentrating on social equity. Social equity has a crucial importance for queer artists. For starters, when we raise the relevance of an artist's homosexuality in their creativity and the crucial impact of queer artists in art history, we are reinforcing the lack of representation, visibility, and social equity of the queer community. The queer activist Larry Kramer said, "You are not a community until you have a history." And now specifically about art, art has a crucial role in social equity. Andre Gide said, "Art is a silver bullet against sexism, intolerance, and hatred. It engenders empathy." And queer art has a key role in nurturing self-awareness and confidence in queers. In essence, you can't be it until you see it. Matthew Lopez, the author of the Tony-winning play, The Inheritance, said it beautifully. "Knowing that I'm part of a continuum of queer artists, people who have felt as I have felt, has consoled me more than anything ever has." And up until very recent times, the majority of bodies represented in paintings have been either the ruling class or those who could afford to commission artworks. A new generation of queer artists, such as Kehinde Wiley, Christina Quirles, and Doron Landberg, are defying the norm, depicting themselves and their loved ones, asserting the value of the queer experience. But Doron Landberg warns us about how, in art, depictions of heterosexual desire can represent war, peace, God, anything you want. But when a queer artist represents desire, the work is immediately pigeonholed to being only about sex. The erotic images constructed by queer males can only be pornographic to straight eyes, he says. Things started changing in 2017 with a blockbuster exhibition at Tate's museum called Queer British Art. And since then, museums are finally beginning to acknowledge the queer heritage in their collections. But as you know, things are changing, with politics turning against the cultural equity of queer rights once again. So part of our social equity leadership should be to ensure that everyone should have, as a basic human right, access to arts which reflect individual identities, affirm personal value, and foster belonging in the community. The 2018 United Nations Declaration of Human Rights noted that cities that adopt cultural equity enhance inclusion, engagement, and diversity, and contribute to positive outcomes across civic life. So, for those in the audience, to implement this resolution, I encourage cities to advocate for equitable representation and resources to support and serve diverse populations, acknowledge past exclusions and change perception by encouraging the participation of artists from groups who have experienced prejudice in the past, and address any implicit biases that may lead to preferences for one artist or art form over another. And just to finish my presentation, I want to talk about how here in California, we have a great weapon for cultural equity that we should take advantage of. It's called the California's Fair Education Act, which was signed into law in 2011, and it amends the California Education Code to include a fair, accurate, inclusive, and respectful reference to contributions by members of the LGBTQ community in history and in social studies curriculum. And it's been proven that the proper implementation of this law decreases bullying, and it improves morale, safety, and student engagement in campus, empowering future queer generations, which is what we all want. So that's it for me. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Great, thank you so much. And now